I want to thank you for joining us for a timely discussion on the U.S.-Iran agreement and the challenges ahead. I'm Kathy Manning. I'm honored to serve as the board chair of Democratic Majority for Israel at this critical time. In his desperation to cut a deal to get out of the Iran war, President Trump has scaled back or abandoned nearly all of the objections he outlined at the beginning of the conflict. And the signing of the U.S.-Iran memorandum of understanding kicks off a new phase of negotiations that will shape the future of Iran's nuclear program, regional security, and U.S. policy toward Iran for years to come. Today, I'm grateful that we've convened two distinguished speakers to share their insights on this topic. Before I introduce them, a reminder, please consider following us on social media. We are on X, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and now Substack. Submit a question by commenting on our live video on those channels. You can sign up for our news and updates on our website, dmfi.org. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished speakers for today. Dana Stroul is the Director of Research and Shelley and Michael Casson Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She rejoined the Institute after serving from 2021 to 2023 as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, the Pentagon's top civilian official with responsibility for the region. In that capacity, she led the development and execution of U.S. defense policy in the region during an especially turbulent period that included accelerating integrated air and maritime defense, addressing Iran's destabilizing activities, formulating the U.S. approach to strategic competition, sustaining the Defeat ISIS coalition, and responding to the Hamas war. She also served as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where she covered the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey. We always enjoy hearing her insights, and we're so grateful to have Dana with us today. Jacob Magid is the U.S. Bureau Chief for the Times of Israel, overseeing the paper's coverage of American policy, Jewish community affairs, and U.S.-Israel relations. He earlier served as the newspaper's settlements correspondent, reporting intensively on West Bank developments, settlement expansion, legal disputes, and regional politics. A Chicago native, Jacob earned a Bachelor of Arts in Arabic Studies and Political Science from the University of Maryland. We are thrilled to have Jacob back with us. Some of us were listening to him earlier this morning. Dana, we'd love to hear your opening thoughts, then we'll go to Jacob for his.
Well, good morning and good afternoon to those of you tuning in from the region. It's a pleasure to join all of you and DMFI for this important discussion today. And of course, alongside Jacob, who I also listen to on a very regular basis on the Times of Israel podcast and always enjoy learning from him. So at this point in time, I just wanted to make 3 points up front. I know we'll get into a lot of discussion during the Q&A, but I think it's important to provide some context for what U.S. policy, longstanding U.S. policy has been with respect to Iran, because it's important to reflect on that history as a baseline to evaluate where we are now and what this means going forward. Number 2, I want to talk about whether or not the Trump administration is, as it claims, negotiating from a position of strength and what the stakes really are in this MOU and where we go there. And then finally, I want to share a few thoughts on where we are in the U.S.-Israel relationship. So first, it's important to just baseline what has been consistent areas of U.S. policy for decades across both Republican and Democratic administrations. And this has been bipartisan when it comes to Iran policy. 1, Iran should not have a pathway to a nuclear weapon capability. 2, Iran should not have a missile program that threatens its neighbors or the United States. 3, Iran should not fund, train, arm, or direct terrorists and proxies that threaten the Middle East and beyond. And I think here it's really important. Right now, so much of the focus is on Hezbollah in Lebanon. But we are talking about Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq, militias that were in Syria, the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, as well as a network of groups and terrorist organizations, sometimes through criminal activities, sometimes through narco-terrorists that Iran has proliferated across South America, across Europe, and even the United States to target civic organizations, Jewish organizations, Israeli institutions, general terror, and even well-documented targeting of former and current American officials. So the network and history of Iran's support for terrorism could not be more important, and that it should stop, that it should be dismantled, has always been a core tenet of US foreign policy when it comes to Iran. I think it's important to baseline those things as we evaluate the MOU and the Trump administration's approach to Iran at this moment in time. Because to be clear, Americans are not secure and not safe as a result of this MOU, nor is anybody, any government, any country in the region, including Israel, nor is any state who has suffered at the hands of Iran's nuclear program, missile program, or terrorist network. And again, that goes far beyond the Middle East. We even saw in the case of the most recent war, Iran launch missiles at Cyprus, at Turkey. Make no mistake, that was challenging NATO, targeting Diego Garcia, a base far beyond the Middle East. So the implications of an unconstrained Iranian missile program are quite important and serious for US interests. In the case of the nuclear program, the MOU requires nothing of Iran at this moment in time. Even worse, missiles and terrorism are not included in this MOU. And finally, the money that is going to come to Iran as a result of this MOU and what we just saw earlier this week in the US Treasury announced General License X will allow Iran to sell its oil at market price in US dollars. This is an unprecedented amount of leniency in the US sanctions architecture that has been the object of bipartisan support and the work of bipartisan Congresses for decades now. So nothing up front on the nuclear program, nothing in the MOU on missiles, nothing in the MOU on terrorism, and such a significant financial windfall that Iran will be able to rebuild these programs. And in fact, we even heard President Trump say they should have some kind of ballistic missile program because they need to be able to defend themselves. Nothing about what we saw with Iran in 2026 was about defending itself. Those were offensive operations against civilians and civilian infrastructures. Why is this such an important point? I think it's important to remember that in the 12-day war last year, 2025, which was majority an Israeli military operation with the United States fitting in for a 24-hour period, part of what the Israel Defense Forces targeted was Iran's missile industrial program. So its ability to produce the solid rocket fuel for the missiles, for the military, for the missile program. And what we learned after the 12-day war was that the Iranians were able to rebuild that missile program much faster than was anticipated. And the rebuilding and reconstituting of that missile program is why Prime Minister Netanyahu went to Mar-a-Lago with such urgency over New Year's between 2025 and 2026. The concern was that the Iranians would rebuild the missile program first and then use that missile program to then protect and rebuild the nuclear infrastructure and nuclear program. There's no reason to doubt that Iran will run the same play now, and this time with the active facilitation of the sanctions relief that it is receiving through this Trump administration negotiated MOU. Final point here. A lot of folks want to compare, is this MOU better or worse than the Obama nuclear era deal, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action? Then some people will come in and say, that's not the right comparison. It should be the JPOA, which was the freeze for freeze that was negotiated before the full Iran nuclear deal in the Obama administration. Apples and oranges. There was not a war fought in order to just have a same negotiation about the same files. So the idea that we should even be in a situation as Democrats trying to compare the JCPOA and MOU, it is I think just an impractical, irrelevant comparison. Democrats did not start a war to address the core areas, only to agree to a bad deal that still does not address the core areas. Okay, second point I think is really important to unpack here. We continue to have very active presidential messaging on Truth Social, as well as statements and explanations of victory from very senior Trump administration officials. The United States is not negotiating as if it is a winner in this MOU. It is negotiating as a loser. This MOU is entirely concessionary to Iran. In the context of this MOU, and this is not up for debate, anybody can read the MOU. Iran gets all of the goodies up front. The only thing it had to do was open the Strait of Hormuz. If the United States was negotiating as a victor, we would demand that Iran take all of its steps on the nuclear program up front, only later to receive meaningful sanctions relief. This is not what we have here. This is a case of Iran getting its cake and eating it too. We have provided, and again, there's no debate here. You can read General License X. It is broad-based sanctions relief. The funds are not going into an escrow account. Iran is not only allowed to sell oil at market price, it is also able to sell petrochemicals to the United States. We are now having Americans contemplate purchasing Iranian oil. It is the complete undoing and dismantling of decades of investment in a U.S. sanctions architecture to keep pressure on Iran in exchange for meaningful steps on the files that have threatened American security. Not only American security, the security of the entire Middle East, including Israel and Europe, the nuclear program, the missile program, the terrorism program. Nothing from Iran in order to receive this broad-based sanctions relief. Finally, U.S.-Israel relationship. I think it's really important to reflect on the unprecedented moment that we're in here. The United States and Israel, regardless of who is in government, regardless of who's in the White House, have always had disagreements. I think this is just par for the course in foreign policy between two sovereign governments. What's different now is the level of anti-Israel public rhetoric in a way that is dangerous and unprecedented. To the extent that we had Vice President Vance last week directly threatening Israel's military procurement from the United States and U.S. military aid. In short, this is unprecedented. Yes, the United States and Israel can have what I think are reasonable discussions and disagreements about the manner of operations, about the level of civilian casualties, about obligations to provide humanitarian aid. But what we're doing now is actually flipping the tables on where the pressure should be. The pressure right now should be on Iran, not on Israel. I think it's important to recall that during the negotiations for the JCPOA, the Obama-era nuclear deal, one of the big criticisms was that the states in the Middle East most affected by this agreement were not included in the negotiations. What just happened here? The Trump administration has gone so much further. It actually made commitments on behalf of Israel without consulting Israel, without giving it a preview of this agreement and what would be expected of it, without including it in any meaningful way in these negotiations. And now there's supposed to be a deconfliction cell not included in the text of the MOU. Maybe this is one of the gentlemen's agreements that Vice President Vance talked about, but a deconfliction cell about what's happening in Lebanon, that again, Israel is not at the table, not part of this deconfliction cell. So again, this is a case of Iran securing concessions in the MOU that go far beyond the core tenets of concern with respect to its nuclear program, its missile program, and its terrorism program. We have now actually, through this MOU, opened the door to Iran playing a more dominant role in Lebanon. And this threatens not only Israel's security. There are no demands that Iran stop funding, arming, training Hezbollah, not that Iran pressure Hezbollah to disarm, nothing like that. In fact, what we heard J.D. Vance, the vice president, say is that Iran needs to rein in Hezbollah. That has never been the U.S. policy objective, to rein in Iran's terrorist and proxy militias. In fact, we should expect and demand much more at this period of time. And finally, I think beyond the Israel file and the fact that the ways in which this really seeds the ground to Iran for regional hegemonic positions is that longstanding U.S. allies and partners far beyond Israel are looking at this too. Because if the United States throws this partner under the bus after the height of this combined military operation, that again was something Donald Trump wanted, not something that Israel dragged him into, something that Donald Trump wanted. What does it mean for other allies and partners that we've made commitments to, that we've made investments to, that we've told we're going to have their back, and then we so quickly flip and basically adopt the narrative or the rhetoric or hew closer to the demands of an adversary like Iran? Iran, I think, here sensed daylight between the United States and Iran, and now they're digging in. They see blood in the water, and they are leaning forward more to link what happens in Lebanon to this broader U.S.-Iran negotiation. And I think it has implications far beyond Lebanon. I think Hamas is watching this. The Houthis are watching this. The militias in Iraq are watching this. And if you needed any proof, Iran's foreign minister Araghchi had a call yesterday with a senior Hamas official. We can only imagine what he said to Hamas. Just give us some time here. Let us work this out and make sure that we have protected Hezbollah and ensured a place for Hezbollah in the future of Lebanon. And then we'll help you out on Gaza. All in all, I think this is the inverse of what you'd want the United States to be doing right now, either for the safety and security of Americans, or for the Middle East, or for Israel, placing all of us at much greater risk. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Should I start? Okay. Everyone, thanks again for having me. It's a real treat to be with Dana. What I thought could be interesting is trying a little bit, the best I can, to play a little bit of devil's advocate and maybe sound out what how the administration would respond to some of these critiques, and then also just give some of my own analysis of where things stand. I think the way that J.D. Vance has tried to explain this issue of giving upfront sanctions relief is that the bulk of it will only come in exchange for actual concessions that Iran gives during the nuclear talks that are supposed to take place over the next 60 days. But there's no doubt that it's starting up front with this sanctions waiver on Iranian oil exports. And the way that they've tried to argue that this makes sense is that, well, if we didn't lift this sanctions waiver, that Iran would still be able to sell its oil because we're lifting the blockade, which that's a choice. But when they're selling that oil, they're giving it to China at a much more discounted rate. So the feeling is that we should be lifting the sanctions, so then there's more oil that comes to the market, and we're not giving China a discount in the process. And that's kind of how they've tried to explain the decision to give sanctions relief up front. That was something that they had initially said they would not do, that everything was going to be in exchange for concessions that Iran was going to make. It was going to be performance-based. But on this issue, it's clearly not the case, as Dana talked about a little bit. There was one thing that I thought was a good point you made about how J.D. Vance's comments were seen as calling out Israel last week, when he's talking about how they're basically the U.S. is the only ally that Israel has left, and they would do well, Israeli ministers and Netanyahu's government, to stop criticizing him, especially because he doesn't say this specifically, but what he's referring to is how a lot of the interceptors that the U.S. was using in the region wasn't going to protect its own assets, but was actually going to protect Israel. And that's something that maybe those who are criticizing the U.S. aren't taking into account, and J.D. Vance references that upfront or publicly. It was definitely something you hadn't heard to that degree, even from Biden officials, which is pretty remarkable, given that you would think that the frustration during the Biden administration was greater. But I think for some, it was a bit of a wake-up call in Israel. I think others are viewing it. I've spoken to officials in Israel who are just talking about Vance as the new boogeyman, and he's the real problem in this administration. But others who recognize that there was maybe some truth into what he's talking about, that you can't kill your way out of everything. Maybe it's not accurate to the Iran conflict, but it might be accurate to other conflicts. And it was something that needed to be said, and arguably should have been said publicly during the Biden administration as well, if that was what the administration felt at the time. And maybe that would have been more effective than sort of having these public spats, but then walking them back and sort of having them behind closed doors, and then still having this interesting dynamic where there were some in Israel who would say that the criticism from the Biden administration was harming the Gaza negotiations to get a hostage deal. And then there was actually recognition, yes, that Hamas was pulling back when it saw Israel being criticized by the U.S. But I guess it's a difficult dance, and there's a lot of domestic politics that are happening on both sides. It seems to be that Vance is also probably influenced by those domestic politics as well, and I guess that's kind of how he decided to weigh in on this in the way that he did. But I think it did spark some alarm bells in Jerusalem. If those are alarm bells that lead to change in the Israeli position, I'm not sure. It's definitely much more difficult now that we're in election season. But I think it was quite remarkable, those comments. On the deconfliction cell, which was something that Vance previewed also, I think, on Monday or so after his negotiations in Switzerland over the weekend. And they're trying to argue that this is going to be something that is used to rein in Hezbollah. It's definitely, there's a huge dissonance in the policy right now after spending all this time trying to detach Iran from what's happening in Lebanon. They created this whole separate track of negotiations that are currently being held in Washington this week, where the idea is to have Israel negotiating directly with Lebanon. It hasn't happened in decades to this kind of at this level, and use these negotiations to discuss ways that the sides can work together to disarm Hezbollah, push Hezbollah back, and limit their influence in the region, and keep Iran out of the equation. So then why the U.S. then turns around and decides to sign this MOU with Iran that actually relinks Hezbollah or Iran to the Lebanese question, and gives them a huge say in what's happening in Lebanon, and basically says that Israel should not be allowed to have any sort of military operation in Lebanon. That's basically in the text of the MOU that all operations in Lebanon must cease permanently. What's notable is though the U.S. even after signing this MOU isn't really enforcing it. There's no public call on Israel to withdraw from Lebanon. There is some pressure happening behind the scenes, and you might see an announcement later this week about a gradual withdrawal from Lebanon in the introduction of what's called a pilot program to try to push the Lebanese forces into southern Lebanon, into places where the IDF currently is, swap them out, and get them started on trying to disarm Hezbollah in those areas or clear those areas from any sort of Hezbollah activity after they've been pretty much razed by the IDF, whole villages. But I think there's pushback right now in Israel, given the frustration with the U.S., and we heard it from Yechiel Leiter, the ambassador to the U.S. yesterday, when he calls the current situation a train wreck. He's somewhat careful not to say that the U.S. is causing this train wreck, but it's clear that's what he means by his words, that this notion that you're trying to disconnect and then reconnecting doesn't make a lot of sense. I think this is a result of having a somewhat incoherent policy where on the one hand you have J.D. Vance and on the other hand you have Marco Rubio, and Trump is kind of oscillating between the two of them. Sometimes he's favoriting Rubio, and that maybe there was the reason that he was taking part personally in those negotiations that were held between Israel and Lebanon. I think there was a meeting in the Oval Office in April or May. But then as I think the Iran war started going in a direction that he wasn't really liking and looking to find a way out, he switched to the Vance approach, I guess you could call it at this point, where there's a recognition that you need to have Iran rein in Hezbollah in order to get a ceasefire with Iran and also some sort of quiet in Lebanon. And the argument that I've heard to kind of justify what the Trump administration is trying to do by allowing Iran to have a say is that currently the situation in Lebanon is that the Lebanese government is simply not strong enough to actually rein in Hezbollah, and that the only one that can do it for now is Iran. And that's a problem, obviously, in the long term. But let's just start and get a ceasefire in southern Lebanon and beyond in the rest of the country, and try to build off of that a situation where we strengthen the Lebanese army, and then eventually they will be strong enough to kick Hezbollah out of the country, or Iran out of the country, limit Hezbollah substantially. But the notion that we can just pretend that we can do that immediately right now is not very realistic, and that's why we're taking this approach. That's a generous, I would say, read on or explanation for how the administration is going about solving the Lebanon problem. It seems more clearly that it just simply wanted a ceasefire with Iran and therefore was willing to concede to Iran's demands to try to protect Hezbollah a little bit more. But there does need to be some legitimate questions about the strategy behind is the Israeli policy in southern Lebanon, where it's not like this buffer zone has created a significant level of security for Israelis in the north, or the soldiers who are being killed on a regular basis in southern Lebanon, including in recent days. And I think from the Israeli perspective, they would probably like to, if they're going to have to withdraw, do it from a position of strength, or do it from their own volition, or somehow pretend to attach it to these negotiations with Lebanon if they can get something in return. And I think there's going to be more pressure on Aoun to meet with Netanyahu, something that I don't think he'll agree to capitulate to. But I think that is something that's worth thinking about on the Lebanon file. I think there was just on Iran negotiations. I spoke with an Arab diplomat from one of the mediating countries yesterday, and his speculation of what was going to happen is that Trump has already hinted at it. He was asked if it's 60 days is a hard deadline last week, and he said no, it's not. If we feel like they're negotiating seriously, we can extend it. And if you look at the political timetable right now, the calendar, if we're talking about that deadline expiring at the end of August, that's quite close to the midterms. It's hard to see that he'll have the political maneuverability or desire to want to restart a war then. And he's even admitted that it will cause massive economic hardship, obviously for the world, but also I think he cares more about the US, and that's not something he wants to see right before the midterm. So this diplomat that I spoke with felt it's pretty likely that we'll see a delay of this MOU or the 60-day period to after, or extension of it until after the midterms. It'll also give Iran time to recalibrate as well. So I think they have an interest, of course, in extending this deadline. But then we're going to come to a point where the U.S. is going to have to decide if it wants a deal that will limit Iran's nuclear program, kind of similar to the JCPOA. The idea of zero enrichment that Vance is notably still talking about in answer to a question last week. The idea of shutting down Iran's missile program completely. Even the civilian nuclear program, it's kind of interesting that they're not ruling that out anymore either. Trump hinted that might be an issue that he's not, doesn't need to put a red line on. So they're kind of hedging on all these issues to lay the groundwork for maybe more concessions. But that is a deal that is on the table after the midterms. Whether the U.S. is prepared to sign it or wants to return to war, that could be, I guess, an option that will be considered. But the notion, this Arab diplomat involved in mediation said that they're going to be able to get something that remotely similar to what they've been talking about is unlikely. And I mean, just look at how it played out with the war, where we talk about total surrender, and now this deal is not total surrender. You can make arguments about why, yes, it doesn't look exactly how we'd want, but we're going to get something better later. But to argue that's anywhere near some of the goals that were laid out in terms of missiles and nuclear and proxy support is kind of not very serious. So I will stop there, I think, and then let you guys ask some questions.
Thank you both for your very insightful opening remarks. I'm thrilled to welcome Jacob back and welcome Dana to the webinar today. I'm Rachel Bombach, Chief Policy Officer at DMFI, and I'm delighted to moderate the Q&A portion of this program. Just a reminder that if you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A box on Zoom, or if you're watching on social media, type it into the comments section. Dana, first to you. In your recent Foreign Affairs article, The Middle East Power Paradox, which is very good, you should read it if you haven't, folks, you argue that military victories do not automatically translate into strategic gains. The United States and Israel significantly degraded Iran's military capabilities. There's little doubt about that. Their air defenses and their defense industrial base, as you outlined. So why have those battlefield achievements not necessarily produced a more favorable diplomatic outcome? Is this a negotiation? Why did the administration agree to this? Is this a negotiation problem on their behalf? Or does it reflect a broader challenge in translating military success into lasting political results?
Thanks, Rachel. It's an important question. One of the things that I wanted to underscore in that Foreign Affairs essay is that if you listen to how Secretary of War Hegseth, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, the CENTCOM commander, Brad Cooper, explained their achievements, they were all in these quantitative deliverables. This many munitions dropped, these many targets struck, these many ships of the Iranian Navy sunk. And I think it's unquestioned that the US military remains the only military in the world or is the only military in the world that can project power beyond its borders at this scale and this scope and deliver such lethal effects inside another country. There is no other military that can do something like that. And what is so remarkable about the US operation, which the United States called Epic Fury, and then the Israeli part, which was called Roaring Lion, is the unprecedented way in which the two militaries worked together. There really hasn't been anything like this since the United States and the UK in World War II. But I think the Iranians also recognized that they were never going to be able to match what the United States and Israel were doing together, and even what they could do individually. The Iranians were no conventional match for what the United States and Israel had. And so their plan was to respond in a completely different, unconventional, or asymmetric way. And so one was to inflict psychological and economic damage on the Middle East, which was why all of the Gulf countries were targeted, and not just US military bases or US associated interests in Gulf countries, but civilian hotels, desalination plants, energy infrastructure, and societies and families and human beings across the Gulf and Jordan are not prepared, like Israel and Israeli society, for the idea that you could be existentially challenged in this manner. So tremendous damage here and destruction at the hands of Iran. And secondly, the Iranians recognized that the nuclear program, the missile program, and their proxy network, after years of degradation post-October 7th and after last year's war, were no longer sufficient deterrents against US or Israeli military action. So they discovered a fourth pillar, and that's really the story of what happened this year. And the fourth pillar is shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. Now, what's happened here is that the Iranians have introduced enough risk and enough question into whether commercial shipping will be targeted that most insurers will not insure, and most shippers are not willing to take the risk to try to transit the Strait of Hormuz. And frankly, this is something that, despite this MOU and despite announcements or proclamations that the Strait of Hormuz is open, we are never going back to the status quo ante. This war will usher in a new navigational order, and we've actually seen the Iranians do this over and over and over. In 2019, first Trump administration response to the maximum pressure campaign, the Iranians upped the ante in the maritime space by targeting Emirati tanks. They had the Houthis do this in the Red Sea in the Bab el-Mandab in response to US support for Israeli operations in Gaza after October 7, 2023. So what we saw was the pièce de résistance in the Strait of Hormuz. They put the entire thing on steroids. They now have realized that they can get major concessions from the United States and its allies and partners by turning the dial up or down on the Strait of Hormuz. Once they have discovered this tool, there's no going back. And that's why, despite the really significant conventional military achievements of this war, nothing about this feels like strategic victory, because there's still doubts about the Strait of Hormuz. The idea that we're ever going back to complete freedom of navigation is in question. And frankly, the MOU basically opens the door for Iran and Oman and others to have a say in this critical waterway in a way that might actually undermine freedom of navigation going forward. And I think the lesson of the Gulf states is that they can't entirely rely on the United States anymore. So there's some remarks today by, I believe, the Prime Minister of Qatar in a Financial Times piece, where he specifically talks about the post-war regional order that the countries and governments of the region of the Middle East want. And they want to include Iran more in the regional fabric of the Middle East. Their takeaway is that isolating Iran and punishing Iran is bad for them. So again, if where we end up strategically after this war is an Iran that's less isolated, a regime that's getting more US dollars, that doesn't have to change its behavior, doesn't have limits on what it can do with its missile program, its nuclear program, its support for terrorism, and actually has the United States opening the door to some sort of active Iranian role in the Strait of Hormuz that's greater than what happened before this war, that's not a strategic win for the United States, nor is it for anybody in the region or the world who actually cares about this foundational principle of freedom of navigation.
Thank you so much, Dana. Let me turn to Jacob now. From Israel's perspective, how is the war being assessed today? Given the damage inflicted on Iran's military nuclear programs, do policymakers there view the campaign as strategically worthwhile? And how has the MOU affected those assessments? And we have a question in the chat from Hannah. How might all of these events affect the upcoming Israeli elections set for October?
Okay, sure. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to try to frame this as a strategic victory. And then we'll point to maybe some of the figures that Dana's mentioning the US is using without giving the other figures about what is left. How many what does Iran still have after all these strikes that the US and Israel carried out? And they're going to also, Netanyahu is going to also try to hedge on the point that these negotiations are still ongoing, that we can still get a very significant set of concessions from Iran. Sorry, I'm getting a call. In these upcoming talks, and he's talking about the importance of maintaining a hard line on the nuclear file and zero enrichment and getting all the stockpile completely out of the country. Things that are likely somewhat negotiable, but not to the degree that Israel would like to see. So I think it's a harder case for Netanyahu to make that this was a strategic victory. But that is kind of the hand he's dealt for himself by pushing this, encouraging this war. And I think what's kind of interesting is that you're hearing a lot of criticism of this MOU in Israel from both critics and supporters of Netanyahu. But most of them, including on all sides of the spectrum, weren't necessarily pushing for something else. In fact, in the case of Bennett and Lapid, they're arguing that Israel should have bombed more civilian infrastructure in Iran, and Netanyahu also wanted to continue striking, regardless of the fact that regardless of whether or not there was a real clear strategy of where that was going, because they've also, like the U.S., gave a lot of different goals for this war that weren't completely clear. Yes, they were a little bit more straightforward on what they were, but even how how the war was actually advancing those goals wasn't clear. If this was about the nuclear file, which Netanyahu said was generally the biggest issue for Israel, the strikes weren't really that was last year's war. That's the sites that were targeted then. This was, I think, as much as there's this aversion to talking about it, now the goal of this was regime change, and it was through arming the Kurds, despite a complete lack of strategy and how Erdogan would respond to that, and given Erdogan's close relationship with President Trump, how that would be very quickly thwarted and not really taken seriously, and left Israel completely without a real plan to move forward and how to actually enact regime change beyond just further strikes in the air. I think you're going to see coming to light in the coming weeks and months more frustration in the Israeli security establishment at the Mossad for pushing this narrative that it was possible, that Iran was ripe for regime change, and we just needed to kind of kick open the door, and these strikes would lead the way to that end. And I think there were others in the IDF that felt that was unrealistic, and I think you're going to hear a little bit more of that frustration come to light unless there's some big success from this MOU, from these negotiations that I don't currently foresee. But again, it's important to note that there hasn't been, I think, a questioning of the broader approach from Israeli policymakers from the left to the right about whether or not the war was a good idea to begin with, or whether or not we need to change. I mean, Bennett sometimes hints at it when he talks about the need that you can't only use military force for every problem. But then he's also tweeting about how he's going to enact regime change in Iran, and he's that Iran should be very scared of him, and he's going to be the one that's going to be able to figure out what Netanyahu couldn't and what Trump couldn't. Maybe there's a slightly better strategy you can use to go about it, but I think it's a little bit naive to be publicly talking about that, especially after all those who were so sure that was going to happen through this war are finding themselves with quite a bit of egg on their faces right now. So I think that is, and that's to connect to the question about elections, about how this impacts them. I think it's going to make it much harder for Netanyahu to campaign. I think he was hoping to use his relationship with President Trump during this election campaign. I think there was even a specific campaigning messaging that was going to be put out over the past couple weeks that was shelved as a result of the not great relationships that he currently has with President Trump. I think people who are very critical of him are latching onto this moment and thinking that it's over, but they did that in the past and were kind of wrong when Trump rallied around him once Trump returned to office. I think that is definitely possible to happen once again, but there is some interesting dynamics that are at play in recent weeks where I think the Trump administration recognizes that even if they see Netanyahu as a partner, and even if there's a real affinity that Trump has for Prime Minister Netanyahu, feeling that both of them were wronged similarly by the deep state and the courts that are trying to prosecute them. But the people that Netanyahu comes with, given the amount of other parties that are refusing to sit with him, make it very difficult for the Trump administration to advance anything it would like to see in the region, be it Saudi normalization, which is going to be a long shot regardless, but definitely not even in the cards with this current government. And if Netanyahu does manage to form a coalition again or remain on as caretaker prime minister and an indecisive result, they're going to be stuck with the same reality where the U.S. can't do exactly what it wants in the region, as if it wasn't already hard enough to begin with because of the results of this war, and kind of some of the frustration in the region with how the U.S. didn't loop them in, and now is ending up with a result that doesn't really make them any safer. So it's going to be harder for Netanyahu to campaign in this issue, but he's a very good campaigner, and I'm sure he'll kind of close the gap towards the end of the election, and I wouldn't count him out. But obviously this is not the result he wanted to see.
Thank you, Jacob. We have a question from our esteemed board chair, Kathy Manning. She said that this deal with Iran is reminiscent of what President Trump did with his Afghanistan deal. Basically, he negotiated with the Taliban, the terrorists, and left out a key stakeholder, in that case, the Afghan government. So he basically, at that point, had surrendered to the Taliban and kicked the can down the road to the next administration while selling out the Afghan government and the people who helped the U.S. for many years. So what, if anything, can the next Democratic administration hopefully do to repair this situation, assuming we get a Democrat who cares about the pro-Israel relationship? I'll throw that to Dana and Jacob if you want to weigh in as well.
Thanks for the question. So first of all, I think there's an important difference between Afghanistan and Iran that's worth noting here. In the case of Afghanistan, Trump negotiated with a terrorist group at the expense of including the recognized government that the United States had worked with for 2 decades to stabilize the country and deliver for the people and be a partner in counterterrorism and a bunch of other issues. In this case, we have a government in Iran that we have for years said is the origin of the sponsoring of terrorism. The behavior of the regime and the regime itself, because of its revolutionary ideology, is the problem. And at the beginning of this war, what Trump said is that he wanted to bring the regime down and wanted unconditional surrender. And now what we have is the legitimization of this same regime, it's the same regime, just new faces. No changes in the behavior, no requirements to change the behavior, no indications that they're interested in changing their strategy to the region. We're working with this government and we're giving them this windfall of sanctions. None of that was actually part of the Afghanistan process. And then even worse is that in the case of Iran, the reason we started this war in the first place in January, well, when Trump was talking about it in January, and I think this is an important point that is really forgotten in the noise around the MOU right now, is because this Iranian regime committed the worst massacre against the people of Iran in the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And Trump said to the Iranian people, help is on the way for you. And now these are the same regime figures that are being welcomed in Switzerland, making the vice president of the United States wait in a room to negotiate with them, seeming to shape the terms of this MOU, And there's nothing about the Iranian people. And in fact, the crackdown against the Iranian people at home is getting worse by the day. They're picking up executions again. They're restoring their reign of terror. So when the United States has said to people, we are on your side, help is on the way, what we are doing now is not just accepting the existence of this regime. We have made no requirements or demands with respect to the human rights or fundamental freedoms of the Iranian people, and we're funding this Iranian regime to keep doing those bad things. Okay, so where does this go for a potential democratic administration? I do think it's worth acknowledging here that multiple administrations, Democratic and the first Trump administration, attempted diplomacy with Iran, and the Iranians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity when it comes to making reasonable concessions with respect to problematic behavior. And so there was always a point, and every president has always said, if diplomacy fails, I maintain a credible military option. In the case of the second Trump administration, that military option was exercised just in ways that delivered no strategic gains for the United States, for Israel, for the region, for the world. That being said, I think it was always important to acknowledge that if there was a military option, you might not change the commitment of Iran's leaders to a nuclear program, and you cannot remove and neutralize the entire threat from Iran, the missile program, the drone program, the nuclear program, with military force alone and exclusively, which is a point Jacob made. You can't bomb your way, and not every problem has a military solution. But it could be, and it was, I think, in previous cases, that the Iranian nuclear program was creeping so close to a threshold nuclear capability that a military option that puts time on the clock may be in the interest of the United States and its allies and partners. So in the case of a Democratic administration, I do not think that Iran will be able to rebuild everything that was destroyed from Epic Fury in the 2.5 years of this Trump administration. And so a new administration is going to have to look at the problem set and say, what do we do with this time on the clock to try to push away and eliminate the idea that Iran could rebuild its nuclear weapon capability and actually have reassurance that they will never have a path to a nuclear weapon, let alone these other problematic behaviors. And to do that, we're going to need to work with allies and partners, and we're going to need to have tools, both a credible threat of military force, the ability to impose sanctions, and also be able to offer incentives in exchange for verifiable steps of Iran. That's going to require national security apparatus. We're going to have to re-empower and rehire diplomats, intelligence professionals, restore civil military relations, make sure we actually have the munitions arsenal and the military capabilities to back up a threat of credible military force with real military force and real military options. We're going to have to consult with allies and partners, and that also means we're going to be need to be in a position of accepting how frustrated and disappointed our allies and partners are in us because of the steps that have been taken right now that have made them less safe.
Okay, so I'll just add a couple points to that thorough answer. I think Vance was pushed on this notion of what happened to your concern over this humanitarian situation in Iran and for the civilians who you called to protest. And he said basically that's our third, we care about it, but it's the third priority after, I think he said, the nuclear issue, and then maybe support for proxies was number 2. I guess missiles has fallen below that at this point. But I think there's a recognition there that you can only do so much. And I think you could argue is even legitimate to say that you need to have a priority, and the top issue is the nuclear file, and that's what the US is trying to focus on. The problem is that they made all these promises about telling all the civilians to come out and take the country, it'll be yours once the bombing is over, and Netanyahu was saying things that were of a similar nature. So I think there's legitimate criticism and questions for them about this issue of where did it go if you were so gung-ho about it initially, and it shows the kind of lack of planning that went into this war. And I think it was more just about finding a tactical win that they saw an opportunity for in the beginning with Khamenei and the other leaders in the same room, and decided to take it and run with it there. On Congresswoman, can I still say current Congresswoman Manning's question? I think
unfortunately not current Congresswoman.
I know, but, I can't say current, but can I still say Congresswoman?
As far as I'm concerned, sure.
Okay, so I will. That I think interesting comparison. I think Dana knows history more about Afghanistan, but it reminded me of how the U.S. approached the talks with Hamas, that there's always the feeling that you should be willing to talk to everyone, and you want to talk to the people who are actually relevant and stronger. And I think Trump in general doesn't like dealing with people who he perceives are weak. So they were in the room with Hamas in ways that the Biden administration felt it wasn't able to do. And they can argue in those cases that maybe that helped bring about actual change and brought the hostages home. But obviously in other examples where it doesn't play out so well, maybe that's the example that we're seeing right now. And just lastly on this feeling that I think is accurate about that the countries in the Gulf are feeling burned by the administration. I was there a couple weeks ago in the UAE and Qatar, and it was interesting. Yes, there is definitely that frustration and feeling annoyance that they weren't looped in initially. In the UAE, there was an interesting about face where it went from frustration to, okay, let's support this war and see how far we can get. And even the rhetoric you were hearing out of the UAE was almost similar to the Israelis in terms of we need to go all the way and finish the job. What that exactly looked like, I'm not really sure. But that was kind of what you were hearing. And now again, you're seeing them walk back that kind of rhetoric and talk about the need to try to recognize that Iran is in the region, and therefore we need to find a way to work together. And that's what all the different Gulf countries are doing right now. And even so, yes, there's this talk about diversifying alliances that these countries are trying to advance right now as a result of feeling a little bit burned. But still, the message that I got at the end of the day is that we don't really have any better option, that China or Russia don't offer what the US can offer us. And right now, it's very difficult, the relationship that we have with the Trump administration. It's very chaotic, but it's only a blip in the system. He's going to be gone at some point, and we'll still be dealing with administrations that we hope are a little bit more coherent.
Thanks, Jacob and Dana. Let me ask one last question, since we do have some Hill staffers on, and I'm sure they'd be interested in this. The Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, INARA, is a 2015 law in the US that mandates any agreement regarding Iran's nuclear program be submitted to Congress for review. And Trump has already said he's not going to send it to Congress, or he may not send it to Congress. But Dana, I'd be curious your thoughts on what role Congress should play in reviewing any final agreement, assuming we get one. And is there anything Congress can do if Trump refuses to send the agreement to Congress, especially considering some Republicans will be perfectly fine avoiding that process and review process and vote?
First of all, to all of my fellow staffers out there, I think it's really important to remind yourselves that this war, Trump's approach to it, and this disastrous MOU is bad for American security, it's bad for American prosperity, and it's bad for the Republican caucus. It is a divider for the Republican caucus. You don't need to own this situation, and you don't need to defend it, and you don't need to compare it to the JCPOA. This is a Trump-created mess. Trump made the decision to go to war without making the case to the American people, without explaining why this was an imminent threat, without coming to Congress first to ask for an AUMF, without briefing members of Congress, which is part of following the law and the Constitution of this country, and without building a coalition that will win. So he should own this. Secondly, when it comes to the sanctions relief, some of the sanctions relief Trump can do through executive action, some of it through waivers that have been provided to Congress. I think that Congress absolutely should be following the money, should be asking for briefings, asking for the pacing. And if, as Jacob said, there actually is a play here, which is that they don't get sanctions relief until they take certain steps, then Congress deserves to be briefed on that, because that's not actually what the MOU says. And there's what the MOU says, and then there's what officials in the Trump administration say is going to happen, and then there's what Iranian officials say. But you all have security clearances, your bosses have security clearances. You should be briefed, because Congress has played a key role in Iran policy for decades and is really responsible for the sanctions architecture that enabled each president to be in a position of strength here. And it's Trump that's squandering that leverage. So I think Congress should absolutely demand to be briefed on these things. And that you should continue to make the case that this is actually about the safety and security of the American people. There are core tenets of Iran policy that have been central and bipartisan for decades, and we should be evaluating the MOU and what goes forward based on those tenets, not on what happened in the past.
Great. Well, with that, I'd like to thank Dana and Jacob for participating, and of course, our board chair, Kathy Manning. And I'm pleased now to turn it over to DMFI President and CEO Brian Romick for closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. First, I want to thank Dana and Jacob for joining us today. Their insights are always clarifying, and we really appreciate them. The situation with the MOU with Iran opens a new chapter of negotiations that will have far-reaching implications for the security of the United States, Israel, and the broader region for years to come. At DMFI, we'll continue to engage aggressively, strategically, and effectively, educating policymakers, strengthening pro-Israel leaders within the party, and ensuring support for strong U.S.-Israel relationship. We want to make sure it remains bipartisan and durable. We need your help to do this work. DMFI is supported entirely by generous individual donors. Your DMFI gift will help us meet challenges before us as well as the ones to come. You can scan the QR code on your screen or go to dmfi.org to make a gift. I also do want to take a minute because I know there's a lot of questions in the chat about the election last night. So just bear with me for a minute. I want to say a couple things. First of all, as we've said publicly in the past, the House majority isn't going to be one in New York City or San Francisco. It's going to be one in San Diego and South Texas, places where DMFI PAC has actually had major wins. We've elected Marnie Van Wilpert over Amar Campanujjar in California 48, and in Texas 35, where we helped Johnny Garcia defeat anti-Semitic activist Maureen Galindo. So I think it's important that we don't over-index wins the left has in the leftmost areas of the leftmost districts in the leftmost cities in the country. New York City is not the rest of the country. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the DSA in clusters and Democratic strongholds, not in these majority maker districts. Just nearby in New York at Hudson Valley, Kate Conley won a contested primary in an actual battleground district. She's a pro-Israel Democrat who is DMFI PAC endorsed. Similarly, there was no major progressive wave in California or Chicago. This is a New York East Coast problem in urban areas that does not impact the places where Democrats need to win. Looking just last night, if we zoom further out, pro-Israel Democrats and mainstream Democrats won major primaries in both Maryland and Utah for safe Democratic seats. Obviously, the mayor's endorsement does carry weight in areas he has done well, but nationally, things are very different than New York City. And I think we all need to remember that. At any rate, thank you again for joining us today, and I hope to see you again on our next webinar. Thank you.